morning. I don't need a prelude. All right, we're good, right? Well, good morning. I'm John Barrera. I'm one of the elders here. And we're going to be looking at Matthew 24 in a minute. When Carrie was just talking about the song and speak to your doubt, or preach to your doubt and speak to your fear, I was thinking, well, that's very appropriate because I'm fearful to come up here right now. And it's not about me, it's about what I got to preach on and how it gets heard. We're going to be looking at Matthew 24, and if you know your Bibles very well, you know what Matthew 24 is, and maybe some of you don't know what Matthew 24 is. Sharing a little bit about myself. When I first became a Christian, I went to this church, and for like 6 months, all the preacher preached on was the book of Revelations. And I was a very new believer, and I really didn't know anything, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the end of the world. The end of the world is coming, and I didn't even know it till I became a Christian. Thankfully, I became a Christian because the end of the world is coming. And after 6 months, I was like, okay, there's more of the Bible than just the book of Revelation. So I started going to a different church, which was very good. 5 years later, I bumped into a guy from that church. I said, what's the pastor preaching on? He said, Revelations. I said, there you go. And some of you know, because I know you well, that this section of Scripture, along with others, have been abused forever. And misinterpreted, all kinds of crazy things. We have people that we know in our fellowship who grew up in a church where it was always the end times. It was always going to end. And as a young lady, she was never going to get married because it was all going to be over before that. So don't worry about who you're going to marry or how many kids you're going to have because you're going to be dead. Or not dead. I guess you'll be alive in heaven, but you won't be here. And then you got the Jehovah's Witnesses predicting the end of the world about every 20 years for 1,000,000 times and all this kind of stuff. So for me, I would just avoid it. I wouldn't talk about it. I didn't want to read about it. I haven't looked at the book of Revelations in I don't even know how many years, I got to tell you. Well, actually I did before I came up here, briefly. Like in the past week. But normally I don't look at it. This particular section I would not read. So God in his wisdom set up the schedule so that I would be preaching on Matthew 24. And to be quite honest, I learned a lot of things. And I want to, hopefully in the next half an hour or less, 25 minutes, I will be able to adequately tell you what I learned. And hopefully you can see what the word says in this section, because it's totally not what I have heard 100 sermons on the radio and in church and everything. It's actually the opposite. So we'll go to that in a minute. I wanted to start with talking about the temple, because it's part of Matthew 24. This is a depiction of the temple. We've seen it here before. This big fenced-in section there, the really big one, is called the Court of the Gentiles. That's where anybody could go who wanted to worship the God of the Jews. And then where you see it gets a little smaller there, that little smaller court, but still have decent size in there, you go through that gate, that's the Court of the Women. And the men and the women who were Jews only could go into the Court of the Women. You had to be Jewish. And they actually have an archaeological find of a placard from there that said, if you enter here as a non-Jew, enter at your own risk. Your death is on you. Then from there, you go up more steps to where the temple is there. In that outer area would be the Court of the Men. And so men only could go into that area. And that temple you see in the middle sticking up, that's the same temple that was rebuilt in about 580 BC. And remember, we did that a few years ago. We studied that, how the temple was rebuilt after Solomon's original temple had been torn down by Nebuchadnezzar. So that was the original rebuilt temple, and in that temple is the Holy of Holies and the temple altar where only the priests could go. So you could see how it segments all the way down to only the priests, and only the priests would ever enter into the temple and the Holy of Holies, and the people that worked with them. The temple was the focus of the Jewish religion. It was everything. It was who they were about. It was what they would do. They did have synagogues out in their little villages, but it was where they went for the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Feast of Pentecost or Weeks, and the Feast of the Passover. If you were a good Jew, this is where you were going to travel to several times a year to worship God. And it was who you were. This was a magnificent temple, started in 15 years before Jesus was born by King Herod the Great. It wasn't finished till about 15 years after Jesus had been crucified. So you can do the math there and figure it was 50, 60 years to be built. And Herod the Great started it, but he actually died. And then it was picked up after that. There's pillars in here that were made out of solid marble and then shined up to a bright white. There was inlaid gold in the roofs and other parts of the facade that they said when you came over the hill and you saw Jerusalem, you would see it from afar. It would look like a mountain with snow on it. It would be shining. And you could see if you lived in an adobe hut like those around it, that this would be the most magnificent structure you would ever see in your entire life. But even more than that, it was a representation of who the Jewish people were. Everything that they did when they were looking back at the Bible, as we would call it, or the Septuagint, the first 5 books, there were all the ceremonial things that you did in the temple, how the Holy of Holies was there, the table of the showbread, the menorah was there. It was all there, and just as it was in their Bible, which is our Bible, but it was still there, and they still worshiped and they still sacrificed according to all the rules that were set out in the book. So Jesus has just come off, as Dan preached last week, basically, I'm not sure how to say it, ripping into the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the hypocrites and the actors that were there, and saying that they're whitewashed tombs, that they look good on the outside, but on the inside they're dead. And he's leaving out of the temple, and we come to where we're going to start today. Now, I thought about reading this whole section through, but I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to read sections. We're going to talk about it, and then we'll go to the next one. So Jesus left the temple right after he had been berating the Pharisees and the Sadducees and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, this is a little bit later, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, it's important to think, okay, so Jesus says this as they're leaving there, say, look at this beautiful building. And he says, I'm telling you that before this generation passes away, it's all going to be gone. It's all going to be torn down. And that would be a super shock to the apostles. So later they go back to him and they ask this question. You've heard me say this before. If you're reading your Bible and you want to study it deeper, whenever there's a question, pause on the question and attempt to answer the question yourself. Sometimes Jesus is asking the question. Sometimes the question is being asked of Jesus. But we should pause there and say, what is the question and what does it mean? In this section, for this question, these apostles would have so much tied the destruction of the temple to them and their world and their culture at that time, as already said. The destruction of the temple, saying that there's not one stone upon another, would have meant to them the end of the world as we know it. So the two questions are somewhat tied together, not totally, but the first thing, Jesus' statement about the temple has brought them in their thinking of walking from the temple to the whatever it is, the Garden of Olives or whatever it is. While they were thinking and talking about it, they're like, let's go back and ask him, because if what he said is true, that must be the end of the world. It would be the end of the world of us. And I couldn't really think of a comparison, except for one that's imperfect, and I may talk about it again later. This is an imperfect example because it's not possible for what I'm going to say to you. But imagine all of a sudden you found out absolutely positively that Jesus never existed and he never was, and your faith has been in nothing. Imagine what that would feel like. Well, for the Jew, the devout Jew, that's what it would be like to have the temple disappear. So, the second temple, we're going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to go on here. So Jesus answers the question, but he actually answers it in reverse order. He answers the question about the end first, not wholly, but in part, and then he comes back to the temple. So that's important to know, because if you don't read this and study it, you're not going to... This is one of the problems when people misinterpret it. They're like grabbing this whole thing and they're gobbling it all together. In fact, they skipped over the question and just went directly to what it says. And then they begin to interpret what it means without ever looking at the question, when will these things happen and what will be the sign of the end of your time coming? So, he is first answering the second question. And it's interesting to me. I learned something here I had never seen. It says, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. And Luke says, make sure that no one deceives you. So right after that, right on at the top, when we read that in the Bible, when we read, let no one lead you astray or let no one deceive you, we should make special attention to ourselves that we're not being deceived by some fine-sounding argument or something that seems to make sense. When you get into these vague parts of the Bible, I have a thing, and it's sort of like, I'm going to go on a tangent here, but it's like science fiction. Everybody loves science fiction. Well, I do anyways. Because in Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever it is, you can just get to make it up. I mean, in a galaxy far, far away, something happened, and I get to make it all up and fill in the blanks with what I want. And when you hear conspiracy theorists and all these kinds of people and end-time talkers, they pick and choose things and then that are vague, and they fill in the blanks with what seems to sound good at the time. And you have to bring some critical thinking to it. And I never really did this on this section either. That's why I'm sharing with you. See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Take care that you are not deceived. Now, I did something here that I never do, but I want you to know it. I just got to confess, I was going right on. I mixed some of Luke's depiction of the same exact story into this section here. It's in italics, and if you see the little Luke there, you can't hardly see it. It says Luke. So I took the exact part of Luke's version of this event and put some things in there because he makes it more clear. But he says the same thing. Let's see. And they will lead many astray. And then it starts, this is what Luke says. Take care that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the time is near. Focus on the time is near. Do not follow them. Could it be any more clear? Do not follow them. Yet how many sermons have we heard? This war and that war, Hal Lindsey and Late Great Predator, all that kind of stuff for you old people. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. How many sermons? This war, that war, this thing, pestilences, the end is near. He says, you're going to hear of all these things. The end is not yet. For these things must happen first, but that is not the end, Luke says in his version. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. A historian went back and looked, and there have been, by his count, 300 wars in the last 300 years. One of the things I often think of is how we are slaves to our own lives and our own minds. We live in a certain time of history. You're born in a certain year, you're going to die in a certain year, and that is the history that you view and see. No more than a week ago, I was sitting at a family thing where it's the end times. It's the end. Well, why? Because there's this war or that war or whatever war, and everything's terrible, and we're all going to hell in a handbasket. And I'm not saying, because I don't know, we're going to get to that. But I looked right at him and I said, if you had been born in 1900 and you were 43 years old during the middle of World War II, and you got Hitler and black shirts and gas chambers and Jews being wiped out, would you not think that was the end of the world? Atom bombs. I mean, I would think that. I think it was April 2nd, 1962. Don't quote me on that. There was a big Civil War battle, Antietam. 22,000 men were killed in one battle. Killed or wounded or lost. They never found them in one battle. 22,000 in 4 days. And they write a song. I mean, the song was actually a year earlier than that. But mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is tramping out his vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Had we been living in that time and we didn't have Facebook, we may have thought that was the end of the world. My point is that there's been many, many times through history that if we were to point to this thing or that thing, we could say, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world. But the point here is, he says none of these things do point to the end of the world. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be famines. There's going to be pestilences, and none of them mean it's the end of the world. And if somebody says they are, don't be deceived and don't listen to them. So that's section 1. And then I just want to say in verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And those who are Christian Missionary Alliance folks know that this is a verse that the Alliance holds dear. As missionaries to the world, that this is the one thing in this statement, that when the gospel has been preached to all people throughout the whole world, then the end will come. And so one thing that we can do that brings about the end is to be diligent about preaching the gospel to all the ends of the earth, to all the ethnos, all the peoples of the world would hear the gospel. So, that sort of ends the end times thing momentarily, and Jesus shifts. And he shifts here in a way that those Jews would know the shift, because he quotes from the Old Testament, Daniel. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. I always would read that and say, this reader don't understand. But Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, never will be. Now, if you don't know anything about the history of the temple, what I've always heard before I came up here or started looking at this in the last couple of weeks is in 70 AD, the temple was torn down by the Romans and no rock was left one another, and that was the end of the temple. That's what I'd heard, and that's not untrue. But there's a little more to the story. So in 66 AD, the Zealots, and we've heard of the Zealots in here before, the Zealots overran a garrison of the Romans and took back Jerusalem. And somebody said to me, well, how could that be? These were Romans. So, well, they just had a garrison there. There's plenty of Jews around. If they can get enough, they could do that. And there was a bunch of disruption in the Roman government at the time. Actually, and I think it was 68 or 69 AD, there were 4 Caesars in 1 year. So they were turning these guys over every couple months. But a general named Vespasian was sent to Judea to quell or quench this rebellion, which he did all through Galilee. And all through the parts around Jerusalem, he quenched the rebellion. But as he proceeded towards Jerusalem, he was called back to Rome, and it was late 69 AD. The reason he was called back was because they were going to make him Caesar, which they did. So when he got back to Rome, he appointed his son Titus to go back and take over his army and go get Jerusalem, which Titus did. So Titus comes back, takes over 3 legions. It happened to be April 14th, 70 AD, and the Passover was to start about 3 or 4 days later. So Jerusalem was filled with people, hundreds of thousands, the estimates are, which would have been very large for the regular population of Jerusalem at that time was probably one of the biggest cities in the world, 200,000. But it probably swelled to twice or even 3 times that size during the Passover. They surround and they lay siege to Jerusalem. It doesn't take them very long to break down the first wall. It doesn't take them very long to break through the second wall. And all that's left is the temple. And the temple was very heavily fortified by the Zealots, and they were crazy and had totally committed to martyrdom. So they held out for a few months till about August. And then the Romans broke through. They overran the temple. And throughout this whole process, according to Josephus, it was so gory, I almost was going to read it, and I thought, I can't read that in church. But Josephus, a historian at the time who was present there, relayed what happened. They killed everybody. Man, woman, child. The estimates were between 200,000 and 500,000 they killed. On the temple, the bodies were piled up. and the blood went down the steps, according to Josephus. And they killed everyone. Then they proceeded into the Holy of Holies, and they took the menorah, they took the table of the showbread, they took a bunch of stuff. They kept 95,000 of the best and strongest men, and they sold them into slavery. Many of them they took to the gladiator thing, the arena, to be gladiators, and let them die there. And then they took 700 of the best looking fighters, and they marched them to Rome with the showbread and the menorah and all the artifacts they had taken from the temple, and had a big parade through Rome, a victory parade with the general at the head like you'd see in a movie. Before they left, Titus gave these instructions, according to Josephus, to the soldiers, and I'm going to read it. Now, as soon as the army had no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remained none to be the objects of their fury, for they would not have spared any had there remained any other work to be done, Titus gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple, but should leave as many of the towers standing as they were of the greatest eminence, that is, Phasaelus and Hippicus and Miriam. They must have named the towers. And so much of the wall enclosed the city on the west side. He said, we're going to keep the west side wall, the one that still exists to this day. This wall was spared in order to afford a camp for such as to lie in garrison in the upper city. So when we leave some soldiers here, we're going to leave this wall to protect them. But for the rest of the wall surrounding Jerusalem, it was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation that there was left nothing to make those that came thither believe Jerusalem had ever been inhabited. This was the end which Jerusalem came to by the madness of those that were for innovations, a city otherwise of great magnificence and of mighty fame among all mankind. And I left out that during the battle, there were fires started, and the whole thing was burning. And Titus actually hoped to save it because he was going to make it a temple to Aphrodite. He hoped to do that, but since it was all burning and it was all a big mess, he just tore the whole thing down. So, now that we've shared all that knowledge, I want to ask you a question. If you were a Jew at the time, okay, where am I here? I'm going the wrong way. And Jesus spoke of an abomination of desolation, and that occurred. What would you think the abomination of desolation was? And I'm going to read again his description. I don't know why I'm so lost here. Okay. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. One thing I left out. Nobody but priests had ever seen the menorah, the showbread, the temple of the showbread. Nobody had ever seen those artifacts except for the high priest and his priests, ever. And now it's parading through Rome in a parade. Let the reader understand. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. If you were living there at that time, that's what you would see. And there would be no doubt in your mind that was the abomination of desolation. As I read this and studied this, will entertain the possibility that what Jesus was speaking of was what they call a double prophecy. You see this in the Word, where something happens contemporary, and then there's another event in the future that mirrors it. I suppose it's possible. But when you hear these end-time books and these things where people fill in the blanks, they have all this stuff about rebuilding the temple and stuff so that they can do this. And there's no evidence that that's happening or ever going to happen. But in order for their view of the end times to be, there has to be a temple because there has to be an abomination in it. So we're going to create one. So what's our point? Let's move on. I'm going to come back to that. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. After those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Or in other words, you won't have to know if you will know he's here. It'll be pretty evident. There won't be these big signs. And then he goes on. He says the lesson of fig tree, which I'm going to skip over. You can check that out at your group studies if you want. It says, then he says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be coming the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. Where in there does it say anything about there's all this craziness going on that we all can look at? It says it's the end of the world. And oh, by the way, on Sunday, or Saturday, I should say, make sure you're in the church because Joni's getting married. He's saying, no, things are going to look really normal. It's going to look like every day. I know me, I'll say to me, I get caught up in the routines of life. I think if I read this, the message I want to give to us all is, as he says, as in the days of Noah. We get caught up in the routines of life, we do the things, and we can think, well, Jesus isn't coming. We won't see signs and wonders, but what he wants us to be is ready. After this, the next time Mike preaches is going to be some parables on readiness and why we should be ready. And I think I personally need to have a higher elevated awareness of being ready, that I'm not two in the field and one will be gone and one will be left. When I read that, and it says, the Son of Man returns, and two men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake. What I think to myself is a couple things. One thing I think is, well, I don't want to be the one left, and I don't think I will be because I know the Lord. But the second thing I thought of was, I'm working in the field with a person who gets left. And I worked with them and I never told them about the Lord. Or maybe I did and they rejected it, I don't know. But it says two are there or one be left. And then the last thing I think is, there's a person there who thinks that they are going and they're not. And I don't know if I've ever said this up here, but I do believe, I think I have said that if I had to describe to a non-believer what it's like to be a believer, to know Jesus, to have a personal relationship, to feel his presence in my life, to read the word and have it come alive, I could not fully and adequately with words explain what that is like. And I know before I was a Christian, if you had tried to explain, and people did, I didn't have a clue. And my concern is always that we might have in our congregation people who come to church, and because they look like they have a relationship, they go to Bible studies, or they, I don't know, look like good people, that they might think they're just like those who do know Jesus and do have a relationship and do have the Holy Spirit, and they may be deceived. So I'd encourage us all to know that we know the Lord. And if you want to talk about that, there's elders available, people available in your church that can talk about that with you. And I'm not trying to scare anybody into thinking that you lose salvation or anything like that. I just want everybody to be sure they're going to heaven. But I think out of this whole section, hopefully some of the things have been cleared up, the misconceptions of what Jesus is saying, that he is going to come like a thief in the night. We're going to be doing our thing, and we need to be ready. And it's about readiness. In John chapter 2, Jesus says, tear down this temple, and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And they looked at him and he said, it's taken 50 years to build this temple. And he was talking about himself. He is our temple. He is our focus. He is our life. He is where we go. And he will not be torn down.